Harvey is one, big and loud, and everything was a struggle. But I have to say, in his case, or in Mike Ovitz's case, or in many others, he was capable of being enormously seductive, of being unbelievably flattering, and by the way, not stupid about the art, able to talk about it. And if someone can seem to be talking that language, then you as an artist are immediately made vulnerable to it.
So why write this book now?
There's certainly a point of view that I have about movies. And in that sense, it was with an agenda that I was putting some of these things out there about what I thought movies could be or had been, as opposed to what they were necessarily becoming.
You said you had a point of view that you wanted to express, that you were expressing about film. And what was that?
It had to do with a certain privilege that I'd had of making movies that were for grown-ups, that were more complex, that had a certain scale, but also espoused a certain liberal humanism, I guess I'd have to call it, that described characters and their contradictions or their complexities in the forefront of the movie, rather than as a sort of add-on excuse for car chases and explosions. And that is a point of view. It never was a point of view until films began to depart from that essence.
You say liberal humanism. Have we moved away from that as an idea? That's certainly how I grew up, but is there still the remnants of that in society now?
Well, of course it's in society now, although it seems drowned out by, larger amplified voices from lots of different places. And I think whether that's about an absence of critical thinking, whether it's about an absence of a certain kind of literacy, there are any number of reasons for it, but I think we can see it everywhere. And I think there is the risk that that becomes part of the gulf in the culture between two very different notions of what describes an examined life.
It seems like the time that you kind of came up, there was a common nomenclature around movies. So
definitely
John Ford or Cassavetes or any of these kinds of filmmakers, we would have been exposed to them growing up. Are we still exposed to these movies now? Is this art form starting to disappear?
It's a contradiction because all of those things are more readily available, say on the Criterion or even on streaming services. You can find things that one could never find before. The irony is when we were growing up, movies were ephemeral. You saw them once, very rarely with a hope of ever seeing them again, except say on the Late Show or something, or eventually in second run theaters in college or something. But our engagement with them was so one-to-one. Our engagement with them was so intense, and that ephemera engendered a kind of intensity between all of us who would discuss them, and they were paramount in our culture. They were atop the food chain of entertainment. And that goes for television too, by the way, but it's been dethroned by games, whose culture is 7 times, the size of movie culture, by your cell phone, by the different sites of everything from YouTube to Comedy Central. I mean, and no longer is it that sort of singular object of our pride in American culture and that we exported and our belief in it. But there's an irony, too, in that having been raised with it, not just as a fan of it, but actually inculcated in film school, having met many of the guys that you're describing, they were still alive when I was in film school, and they would come and talk to us about the tradition of American narrative filmmaking and what that meant. And what it meant was movies that obviously, were designed to entertain, but indeed could encapsulate real ideas. And ideas gave movies the size in addition to the scale that they had to support those ideas.
It's so rare to have a collaborator, even for a couple of movies. But to have a guy like Marshall, that relationship, what advantages has that created for both of you over time?
Well, I mean, it began and remains a friendship, a deep, deep friendship. And that gives it the advantage of extraordinary forbearance in the kind of struggle of collaboration that often takes place. My respect for him and what he is capable of as well as an artist is just abiding. And so I think we have that for each other, and we've demonstrated it to each other again and again. And I also think that in addition to each other's scourges, we've been each other's teacher. And I think, like people and their pets, we've come to resemble each other, and our strengths maybe have exchanged places in certain ways. But more than that, I think there came to us early on, because of some very early success, an understanding that it wasn't necessarily about my best idea or his best idea, but there was a third thing that might emerge, and the commitment to that third thing, which might have been one of our ideas adapted or expressed differently, but that somehow became a consensus of two, and that two became one. And I also think that there's a way in which that kind of confidence in another person creates a certain license. It's a license to reveal yourself, to articulate an unformed, shameful, secret idea, and that you're safe enough in doing it that you'll get past your own inhibition, but even the other person might identify it and say, no, that's it. And the thing is that we all know there's the famous essay by Emerson about self-reliance. And the key to that essay, in the midst of a long essay, is when he says that unexpressed thought, that thing that you are afraid to say or that you put out there alone, is ironically the thing that resounds and it resonates through the culture or through politically or through other people. And that to be liberated to express that stuff can lead to originality in your work or just a certain kind of voice.
I have a question. You were talking about film, but then you also pivoted very early on and together with Marshall create this first, this show, 30-something. Were you thinking about, does the character come larger than the idea? Was there a different way of approaching that, from the big screen to something that we're watching in our home? Or is that process still similar?
It didn't. If you remember television at that moment, in half hours, they had begun to try to explore certain character things, but they were done comedically, familial things, domestic relationships. But drama was the purview of franchises. Everyone was a doctor or a lawyer or a cop. And what we did was not unfamiliar in drama. God knows, the kitchen sink dramas of the 40s and 50s, and everyone from Arthur Miller onward to William Inge were doing great dramas. And even in movies, generationally, Larry Kasdan had done The Big Chill. And so I think what we did, though, was to say, this can exist in 1 hour drama. We also, when we're very hand to mouth, it was a kind of a sophomoric lark thinking we were doing something that nobody would ever want to do on television, but we did it. And to our surprise, they did. And it took on greater consequence as we realized we had to do something that went on and grew and deepened. And we came up with the notion that we had always both been very, very interested in epic filmmaking. And that's been played out in some of the movies we've made, but that there was something epic in the quotidian, that there was something epic in everyday life. And that if we could lower the dramatic stakes, we could heighten the neurotic stakes, I suppose, and that was worth talking about, that our lives and everyone's life was worth an examination in a more, microscopic level. And so that then became, I think, political in some way, that, to talk about that in a culture that at the moment was still very afraid of ambivalence and of that sort of dialectic of experience that we were trying to talk about.
When you were on your first set, the Woody Allen set, did you have any idea that you were looking at something special, an artist that was a very special artist? What was your thought when you were doing that?
Initially, it was just to go on a film set. It was the first one I had a chance to go on. And I had certainly enjoyed a couple of his early movies. I had seen Take the Money and Run, and I'd seen Bananas. But if you recall, they were, lovely but shticky. I'd liked his stand-up stuff better than those movies. But even as I was on that set, a very curious thing happened, because I saw this relationship he had with Diane Keaton, which was very friendly, that had once been, but was no longer a romantic relationship. And yet that friendship endured. And that was interesting. But then when I saw the script, it was called Anadonia at the time. It was the script for what became Annie Hall. It took that character, Diane as a character, and that relationship of the two of them, and it was transmogrified into this artistic statement about men and women, about relationships and why they work and why they don't, and what the dynamics are. And I was gobsmacked. And I saw there was something of a very deep ambition and intelligence at work there. And so when I saw that years later, it was 2 years later when that movie ended up coming out, but all those that followed in its wake it was a remarkable commitment to trying to create a more sophisticated cinema about men and women. Think of it what you will, find fault with it as you might. It was hugely ambitious. And so I was privy to it because I'd seen it at its incubatory stage. And it had a very definite resonance when 10 years later we did 30-something, which was to trade on the personal and to try to elevate it into some more artful form.
I guess it was his birthday party in New York where it was such an array of characters at the party. What kind of influence did that have on you, seeing that so early in your career and being at the actual party, even though I don't think it turned out that particular party turned out so well for you, you know?
No, it was like many things. It was a mixed blessing to go there.
Yeah.
It was not dissimilar to having these people come to AFI when I was 22 years old. They were all there. All of the greats were still alive. And so to sit there and listen to them talk about their experience, at one hand, it was inspiring, but it was very daunting. It was as if to say, what could that possibly have to do with me?
Right.
And so to be at a party like that and to be confronted with certain, gods and goddesses is to feel a little bit like Pip going to London in Great Expectations, thinking that you are way on the outside of culture or society and never will be. And yet there's a flame that is lit. There's an ambition. There's a desire to identify and be included and be part of that world. And the fact that as years went on, I was able to, in fact, work with some of those people, fulfilled some, very childish wish about who I, might be as an artist, and even as not just an artist, but as a member of a club, which we all, aspire to.
In the book, each time you talk about one of these projects, you talk about, well, I saw an article and I thought this. Well, there's millions of articles always floating around. The agents will just send you articles all day long.
Yeah.
What is it about the selection process? Like, how do you actually select the article that you say, okay, this is Shakespeare in Love. Okay, this is,
I that's how do you describe who you choose to marry? It's ineffable, but it is touching certain things that as you dig deeper, you come to understand, and sometimes don't even understand till after it's done. But it is a very alchemical response. It's a galvanic skin response. The hairs on your arm raise, or you think about it and you can't get it out of your mind. But I also think that it's some intuitive understanding of what makes a story. There are several things that are happening at once. One is your avidity, your attraction to the world or the people or the story. But you also have to put it to the test, which is pretty quick, I think, and maybe an unconscious process as to, there is a story in that. And that could have been a piece of history. It could have been a newspaper article. I mean, I'll give you just a brief example. When I first read the article in the Utne Reader about the drug war in South Florida, it was about a drug bust that had gone awry where the DEA and the ATF and the Miami PD got into a running gun battle with each other because they were all running sting operations. They all thought they were all bad guys. And I looked at that, I thought, this is really nutty and comic. And when I first sat down to think about it with Steve Gagan, the first thing that emerged from us was a kind of a satire. And yet, as we dug deeper and as we confronted what some of the statistics were and the actual practical notion of addiction and its ubiquity in the culture, I realized there was a more serious story there. But that was a process. I saw something in it that I thought was one thing and then became another. And Blood Diamond, the script that we first read that was written by someone else, it was in part set in a moment in culture, but it in no way examined the depth of what the story was. The character that we read was an American mercenary, so he had no sense of the land or his connection to it. So as a protagonist, he seemed monolithic and vacant in some way. But the minute that he became Rhodesian and had a connection to that land as his own birthplace, suddenly he was in a dynamic moment of conflict, self-loathing, ambition, amour de pays, all that stuff. He was possessed of that. And that then put him in a very different relationship to the Mende farmer, fisherman in this case. And the American journalist didn't exist. But that was an opportunity for me, I felt, even as a storyteller, to get in some of the exposition to the uninitiated about what that story was, and yet give her a goal as well. And you throw that all together and it becomes a story. So I saw already in it something, but I didn't know what it was necessarily. I just dug for it.
You talk about classical structure in the form. If you go to the Museum of Modern Art and you look at the Picasso paintings and you look at them when you're 20, and then you come back in 10 years, and then you come back in 20 years, you come back. Each time you come back, you'll see totally different things in the painting, and the painting hasn't changed.
Yeah.
So when we talk about a classical structure, do you see your own art as evolving into a different form?
I don't know if I'm as good as a critic of myself as I maybe might be, but maybe I'm happy I'm not. I mean, let me relate to a conversation I had with my daughter. My daughter is a fledgling novelist, and we were talking about something she'd written. And I told her about reading Moby Dick, that I first read Moby Dick when I was 20 or 17, whatever. And it was about this guy chasing this whale and his obsession and And then maybe I read it again when I was 40, and I realized it was about transcendentalism and the absence of God, and how we are all, yoked together in that way that, Queequeg and Ishmael are yoked. But when I read it finally, a third time, it was all about the knots and the sharpening of the spears and the work. Now that's the same book, and I've changed. The book is the same. So I don't know, is my work the same but viewed differently? It hasn't been a self-conscious attempt to change it. On the other hand, I know the subjects have changed, but I'm not sure the approach has.
In the book, there's a little passage about Joanne Woodward and Paul Newman. Then you go all the way forward to Tom Cruise, as modern a movie star as you can have. You spend a lifetime working with actors. When you arrive on the set, for the first moment, whether it's Matt Damon or it's Leonardo DiCaprio or it's Tom Cruise, what work do you have to start doing as the director to understand and make it possible for them to do their work? Because they can't be sick. The camera says action and they have to do the thing. How, as a director, do you prepare for all that?
I would say the preparation begins long before that moment. And not just with what's come before with other actors, but I think you have to forge with that actor some common nomenclature, some vocabulary. And that vocabulary can be formed while you're having dinner. It could be formed if you go to a museum, if you're doing night maneuvers with the armored cavalry in a tank, if you're talking to, as we did, talking to FBI agents or undercover CIA agents who are giving you access, or you're going, all of the various ways that actor might prepare and you might prepare. In any way you can find to do that together or talk about it, you're already having a certain common parlance. And the time that you spend together, whatever that time is valuable. And also, I think that it's at least the simulacrum of a intimate relationship. You end up talking about your families, or you gain a certain amount of insight based on that. But it's also true that there is one thing that that you can do, that you can devote yourself to the creation of an ambience on that set. And when I don't mean just the ambience, I mean the actual room feels right, that the props are correct, that the thing that he's wearing or she's wearing feels appropriate to the moment. And that goes along with everything in terms of that script that you as a writer or as a director working with the writer have created a scene that doesn't oblige them to perform or to sell or to do too much, but rather than to be in that moment. And if they can be in that moment, and if the staging that you're asking them to do, again, doesn't so oblige them to do something that is not normative, then it can feel like cheating. It can feel comfortable from the outset, and they can feel at home. I'll never forget the first time I went on a really good film set with a great set decorator. It was in About Last Night, and I was very young, and it was not a lot of money. And there was a scene in the girl's apartment. The set decorator was showing me the apartment, and she showed me the bathroom. I walked in the bathroom, and I opened the cupboard of the bathroom cupboard, and there were prescriptions there for the character that were the correct prescriptions there. There was no notion that the script was ever going to need those things. And in the grout of the tile, there were smudges from where their makeup and eyeliner would have gotten into the grout. And I'm not sure I ever photographed any of it. But for that actor to walk into that bathroom at that moment, I think she knew that she was in good hands. So that's another thing. And the third is finally to understand that you have cast these people for a reason. And there has to have been a certain giving up of control, that this illusion that the director is, some God figure who is authoritarian and in control is quashed very quickly when you realize how many people are contributing and you have a benefit of listening to, but also just how much a really good actor has to bring to any moment. And you're a fucking idiot if you don't listen and allow that to happen.
There's a moment in the book where you talk about pushing Denzel in Glory so far. How do you know in that moment, to really actually push, and the person's not going to combust? What is that sort of moment? And you've done it several times, but
yeah, I mean, I think it's a kind of pushing that is not. I don't think it's in any way brutalizing. It may be a little bit exploitative, I guess, but I had come to understand already that this was a person of great strength and resources, but also of a professional understanding, that duality that only the greatest actors have, where they can be in a artificial circumstance with a camera right there and 50 people around them and everything that entails, and yet have a personal experience that is truthful, however real or feigned, but nonetheless is happening. And that their focus can be on two things at once. That they can, I knew, or at least I intuitively knew, that he, however much he might have felt that I was transgressing on some relationship, that he would also know that what was happening as a result of it was something that he too wanted. Mm-hmm. And even that was there for him to fight against. It gave him an obstacle. It became a dynamic moment for him, for that actor, rather than a canned moment. And it became a new moment, which is, of course, the thing the camera loves more than anything, which is the thing that is happening for the first time. And so that's what happened.
Years later, you put a bicycle in his path as he's walking up to a house.
Yeah.
So where does that come from? Because that's not written down in a book. It's just the moment of creation.
Yeah, I can't. Look, the things that happen in a scene between two actors that are the unexpected scene are often the thing that you love most. And so you learn at a certain point to, in subtle ways, try to introduce an element that may be new. I mean, so much of life is like that. Driving your way to work. Something happens that's different in your lovemaking. Anything can affect another thing around it. It's a little bit like chaos theory. That fly that flies into the room ends up bringing down a building. Those things have an effect. And also, filmmaking it's not perfect. It's anti-entropic. You're keeping away this outside force. But I object to those films that I look at and I see every storyboard being shot exactly as they were planned. Not that those guys aren't hugely gifted, but I'm interested in what is really happening and how can that affect me and how can I affect it and how can it be shaped and how can it surprise. And there have been so many things that happen in the course of making movies that are apart from what the expectation were, and they're delightful. That moment that I describe was absolutely unconscious, and yet it was in the interest of trying to create a reality that was familiar to me and I thought might be familiar to him. He's a father. He has kids. I'm sure there were bikes all over his lawn, however nice his house is. I'm sure that I have spent a disproportionate amount of time cleaning up after my kids. So the fact that I did that was not a brilliant moment of Stanislavski. but it was something about a commitment to a default, that the default is realism of a certain kind. And he responded brilliantly, as I somehow knew he would.
Was your experience with Liv Schreiber and that movie different than your other movies? Because all of us on this call, our families come from that part of the world, you know?
Yeah, I've done two with Lee. I've done two with Liev now, and his brilliance is so inspiring. I think that initially, for me and Liev, we had an engaged relationship that began one place, and he is so precise. If you think his theater performances, when he's doing the classical repertory or just the words, and he is so well prepared. You can't make movies like that. You can't be that precise, and particularly when you don't have a lot of time and you don't have a lot of money and things happen and you're supposed to make them work on the day. And I, after a certain point in my career, was willing to roll with that. And I think the first time I put Liev in a situation like that, he sort of was really thrown by it a bit. And we had a bit of a confrontation about it until I basically said to him, that's who this character is. This character is reactive. He doesn't think. He doesn't plan. He just reacts. And he's so smart at that moment when, I saw the penny drop, and that was it. It was just, and it was a love affair from that moment on and into the next movie when, again, he literally learned Russian. It wasn't like he was, faking all those sounds. It was this amazing amount of preparation, but preparation so that he could then be free to throw it away, which is what DiCaprio did too when he's working on the accent of Afrikaans, that he wanted to be so comfortable that he didn't actually have to think, that he could just be.
Dealing with actors and then dealing with a guy like Roger Deakins, what was that experience like?
He's an artist, and as an artist, he has a point of view, and if you're smart, you'll listen, but you'll also listen to the key grip and to the set designer and to the editor and all the people who are contributing. And Roger, in the first thing we did, Roger had been a doc cameraman. I think it was it The World at War, that British documentary series. He was in Eritrea, and he's just like the best ones. You think of a cinematographer and you think of their images, but the best ones are storytellers. They are storytellers with you, like you. Their interest is in telling the story and how best to do it. And how can an image enhance that story or lift it up or obviate words? How can those images fill in something that otherwise may have seemed a little bit artificial? How can it give it the breath of life? He's just, he's great, and he's hardy, and he's, he was strapped in, hanging out of helicopters and fearless. But they're all, from the very beginning, I had, Freddie Francis shooting Glory, who had already been one of the gods of the business for 30 years when I met him. John Toll was, just tireless. And Freddie was tireless when he was, 65 on the set. Even Eduardo Serra, Brad Young. These guys, this has been just a parade of gifted people.
Hollywood attracts the greatest artists in the world, and they're sensitive people. Ultimately, these people who do these incredibly difficult, elegant, beautiful things for us, to watch. But outside of them, there are a set of sharks, and you mention a few in the book. You talk about Mike Ovitz, you talk about, Harvey Weinstein, and these, in the book at least, are portrayed as very unpleasant experiences dealing with these people. How does that affect what we call the movie business and all of these artists to have this other class of people who are doing that?
Well, unfortunately, it's called the movie business. It's not necessarily called the movie art.
Yeah.
And so there are these people who are endowed with responsibility by multinational corporations or by banks or by whomever to be the arbiters of that. And many of them are not necessarily sympathetic. When I mean sympathetic, I mean artistically, sensibility-wise attuned to what the issue is of creation. They're interested in the profit and loss structure of a business. So there's an inevitable clash, and there's a secret loathing that exists between those two groups, that they think that we are children, being, plain and without irresponsible, and we think they're Philistines who are, incapable of understanding what it takes to do it. So there's an inevitable clash that exists there. Certain people are really able to understand that and assimilate that into their business model, and certain artists are able to then come closer to being sympathetic to their issues. And I think at times I've been that, and at times I've worked with other people who are capable of understanding my issues. But then you come upon someone who is, I think aggression is the best word, fascistic is another word, where this is a business that's not really a business because there's no governance. There's no real board of directors who are, in any way scrutinizing how this business is run, really. There's no corporate governance. And so people get away with murder or close. And you have people whose aggression goes unanswered, unpunished, until finally, in one particular case, it is. But I felt in my dealings with him that he deserved, some sort of punishment long before the sexual depredations were revealed. But there are others, because I think we, as artists, tend to be more socialized, tend to be more internal, tend to be a little bit afraid of that kind of confrontation that it takes to go up against people like that. And so they get their way. And, Harvey is one, big and loud, and, everything was a struggle. But I have to say, in his case, or in Mike Obitz's case, or in many others, he was capable of being enormously seductive, of being unbelievably flattering, and by the way, not stupid about the art, able to talk about it. And if someone can seem to be talking that language, then you as an artist are immediately made vulnerable to it. So it's the hard part. It's the hard part, and it never changes. And that was the pleasure that I had in reading, books about what Frank Capra had to go through, or what, Preston Sturgis had to go through, or Billy Wilder, and there was something comforting to that. Okay, well, this is what you do.
Well, you talk about that in your book about the importance of failure. That you need to feel the lows to feel the highs.
Yeah, I think it's more than that to me. It's that we live in dread, always in anxiety about anything that you're doing, that it will not work. But to add to it this idea that the outcome is going to be judged is a really big burden. And if you are in any way middle class and have somehow internalized that pressure, what was amazing to me about failure is that success is essentially mystifying. You don't know how to question it because it worked. And so you are a little bit uneasy, like, well, can I do that again? Or how did I do that? But when you flop, when you fail, you apply a kind of scrutiny to try to analyze what happened. But more than that, after you have failed, unarguably failed, you wake up the next morning and what do? You just, put on your shoes and go on. And, what you realize at that point is you were afraid of failure because it was going to kill you, that it was going to end you in some way. Yeah, the same way that, children initially are sometimes afraid of, yelling at one parent because they're going to damage them. But they realize, their parents are all, are hardy, they can take it. And the same thing with your own self-image and your validation. You go, okay, well, I still have the same tools and resources that brought me to this place, and they could be reapplied, and I have no choice, and I'm alive. And I think what happens after that is the next time, because there always will be a next time, you're a little bit less invested in the outcome.
I grew up, my parents would just bring in movies. We'd rent them on 16 millimeter and they'd just show them on the wall. Now it's like we have streamers, we have artificial intelligence. And at least from where I sit, it seems like we've sort of fractured this beautiful thing. There's still great movies that get made, but they're not as frequent as they once were in the past. How do you see this new era? And, I guess the zeitgeist of inspiration flies around. Sometimes it's in architecture, other times it's in paintings, and for a while it was in movies. Is it flitted away from us? Like, where do we feel we are today?
Well, I wonder what it would be like to be a young director now thinking of directing. and think of what you're looking at. If you're not looking at some of the things you're describing and some of the films that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, what is it that you're aspiring to? And that, to me, is a very interesting question. But, it has been proven at times to be secular, and maybe will be again. But I don't know when the experience of watching a film will have become solitary on your phone, in your house. But then again, you're describing looking at them on 16 millimeter in the basement. And I, by the way, I had a friend who used to show those movies, and that clackety clack of a 16 millimeter projector as you're watching it is not the
Right.
most, inspiring circumstances. And yet you engaged.
Yeah.
So maybe it's just about that allure and that irresistible thing of what a story in a movie can be that will inspire other young filmmakers to find ways to present that to audiences. On the other hand, the means of distribution are really different, and they're going to keep changing. And I'd like to think that there may be certain ways that young filmmakers will be able to disrupt them further and get them out there on their own and find a way to put them forth through social media, TikTok. The word of mouth will create the desire to see certain things that might otherwise have been forsworn by the conventional means of distribution.
So, of course, when you say TikTok and social media, it's not a great feeling for the future of movies. But, the other thing I think is it is a 40,000-year-old art form.
Yep.
It will continue. Yeah. How do you feel about it?
Well, what you hope is that it isn't relegated to some quaint thing like opera.
Right.
It was always the populist art form. It was the thing in the nickel cinema, and it was literally that thing that brought the culture together in creating these myths and these tropes of storytelling. I would hate to think that it becomes rarefied. It's already becoming balkanized between, art films and then the Marvel universe and everything like it. So I don't know. I think there's absolutely the possibility that a certain part of the film business will become, well, I'll use a word like books. I'm sorry, but in a country of 350 million-ish people, and with books being written and even self-published at 1 million a year at least, yet you feel that fewer and fewer people are reading. That's obvious.
Books are being banned. Well, let's just say that. And burned.
Well, yes, that is. Yeah.
There's a lot going on. When you were talking about Harvey, for example, it did remind me of somebody else in the world who gets away with a lot.
He whose name shall not be said.
And that person won't be named because they'll shut us down.
Because he may appear to us if we...
Shamelessness is not punished. The thing that we miss most is the pillory. The idea that someone is put in the public square and shamed.
Yeah.
That is rewarded or at least ignored by a large enough number of people as to encourage it.
I'm not sure how that or when that evolved, but it feels like, we've been heading towards that, for a very long time.
Yep.
In a political sense, don't you feel that comes from sort of the end of the World War II framework in a sense, that we, all our parents went through these incredibly hard times and now we're coming to the end of that and people have forgotten?
I don't know. There's a really wonderful book. Kurt Anderson wrote a book called Fantasyland, which I recommend because he traces America's fascination with charlatans and their willingness to accede a great deal of power and influence to them as this innate wish that is somehow baked into our DNA.
Ed, thank you for spending so much time with us.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Everyone watching.
Thank you. I got to plug the book.
You got to plug the book. Here's Flops and Other Illusions, My 40-something Years on Hollywood by Ed Zwick. Everyone also, please, Ed has just an incredible body of work on film and television, and go back and watch these films and these TV shows. And we didn't even talk about My So-Called Life, which was another extraordinary moment.
Well, you have a big career, Ed,
Thanks.
And a lot to look forward to. So
yeah,
I certainly hope so. But listen, it was very, very nice talking to you both, and thank you for it.